Patient 0, page 83, round 3. Mary fought back, writing letters, demanding her civil rights, and pleading for help to get her released from quarantine. 3 years later, the New York Supreme Court agreed to hear her case. While Mary was on North Brother Island, a surprising thing had happened. 50 other healthy typhoid carriers had been identified just in the state of New York. Not one of them had been sent to North Brother Island. Health department officials admitted that perhaps they overreacted. Mary won her case and her freedom on the condition that she agreed not to work as a cook again. In 1910, after 3 years as a prisoner of the New York City Health Department, she was allowed to cross the river back to New York City. The health department didn't see it as their responsibility to train Mary for new work. Instead, they gave her a job as a laundress, one of the hardest, worst paid jobs for a woman at that time. At first, they checked on her frequently. Then, as the weeks and months passed, less and less regularly. Finally, they lost contact with Mary altogether. What was she doing? Where was she living? It seemed no one cared any longer about the healthy carrier who had caused such a stir only a few years before. Then, in 1915, a New York City maternity hospital had an outbreak of typhoid. 25 doctors and nurses got sick. 2 died. The hospital employment records showed that a new cook had been hired just weeks before the outbreak. The head of the hospital brought in George Sofer and showed him a sample of the cook's handwriting. George knew it right away. I saw at once that it was indeed Mary Malone. Just to be sure, George called Josephine Baker to the hospital. Sure enough, Josephine wrote, there was Mary, earning her living in the hospital kitchen, spreading typhoid germs among mothers and babies and doctors and nurses like a destroying angel. The health department sent Mary back to North Brother Island, where she stayed for the next 23 years. Mary died in quarantine in 1938. Villain or victim? From the beginning, newspapers had a field day reporting on Mary Malone's case. When an article in the Journal of an American Medical Association in 1908 called her Typhoid Mary, the tabloids started using it too. Before long, Typhoid Mary was a household name. Today, we call anyone who spreads diseases, initially or not, a Typhoid Mary. Intentionally or not, a Typhoid Mary. Mary Malone's story still fascinates people. Articles and books and plays and movies have been written looking for answers to many questions we still have about her. Did she suspect, before George Sofer first approached her, that she might have had something to do with the typhoid that struck all the families she worked for? Why did she risk going back to cooking after she finally won her freedom from North Brother Island? Was she a villain? Or was she just an ordinary person whose life was ruined by an uncaring system? Mary was a woman, a servant, an Irish immigrant to the United States, unmarried and with little education. All those things meant she had very little power in the society in which she lived. Yet she wasn't afraid to chase officials away, elude doctors, fight the police, swear, argue, and write angry letters until the courts were forced to take notice of her. Doctors and officials were no doubt surprised to see Mary standing up for herself so fiercely, and her behavior may have branded her as a problem case in their eyes. There's another reason Typhoid Mary's story continues to interest people. It raises questions about how far governments should go when they try to protect the public from epidemic. Was it too far to keep Mary Malone in isolation for so long? During the SARS epidemic of 2003 and the Ebola epidemic of 2014, and again when COVID-19 struck in 2020, people returning from afflicted areas were ordered into quarantine. Putting people into quarantine, even temporarily, means they may lose their jobs and be unable to provide for their families. Public health officials have to try to balance individual rights with the needs to protect the public from diseases. A vaccine, and a world war. Typhoid had killed thousands of troops in the Spanish-American War of 1898. So in 1911, when a British scientist named Arthur Wright developed a vaccine for the disease, Army doctors were eager to put it to use. They got their chance during World War I. The vaccine became mandatory for all soldiers in the US Army, and the results were impressive. During the Spanish-American War, typhoid had infected 142 out of every 1,000 soldiers. But in World War I, the rate fell to less than one infected person per 1,000 soldiers. The future of typhoid. If we're lucky enough to live in a city with a working sewer system and a reliable supply of clean drinking water, chances are you've never heard of typhoid fever. In most North American and Europeans, typhoid is a disease of the bad old days, before engineers, public health doctors, and city planners figured out how to safely dispose of all human waste generated by cities full of people. But in many parts of the world, typhoid is still a terrifying reality. The World Health Organization estimates that between 11 and 21 million people get sick with typhoid every year, and up to 161,000 of them, mostly children, die from the disease. At least 1 in 6 infected people are asymptomatic and do not realize they are carrying the bacteria that causes typhoid. There are vaccines that can prevent typhoid, but in countries where typhoid is most common, the cost of introducing a vaccination program is too high, as are the costs of ensuring that everyone has access to clean drinking water. Meanwhile, the bacteria that causes typhoid is mutating, producing a new strands of typhoid that resist the antibiotics, a superbug. People who develop drug-resistant typhoid stay sick longer and are more likely to be hospitalized or to die from the disease. In 2016, an outbreak of drug-resistant typhoid emerged in Pakistan, and by 2019, it had infected 11,000 people and caused over 100 deaths. Turn back to page 85. Tools of the trade, quarantine. Quarantines have been used for centuries to contain epidemics. By keeping people who have been exposed to a disease separate from the rest of the population to see if they get sick. The word quarantine comes from the Italian for 40 days, quartia guarina. During the plague pandemic of the 1300s, that's how long the city of Vienna made ships wait in the harbor before docking to be sure no one on board had plague. As the Black Death raced through Europe, other cities began using quarantines. Sometimes entire neighborhoods or towns were sealed off to prevent plague from spreading. But quarantines could backfire. If people in infected cities suspected that a quarantine order was coming, thousands would flee, hoping to get out before they were shut in with the sick and dying. Inevitably, some of the people running away from the quarantine would develop plague, spreading it far and wide. Quarantine is one of the social distancing measures we still use today to control the spread of diseases. In 2020, many countries began requiring anyone returning from an area affected by COVID-19 to self-quarantine for at least 2 weeks. New Zealand instituted a rule that all travelers must report to a quarantine station and stay there for 2 weeks, returning to their homes only when they tested negative for the COVID-19 virus. Turn to page 86, the Irish potato epidemic. Mary Malone was one of many Irish people who came to North America in the 1800s and early 1900s. It all started in 1845 when Irish potato farmers discovered their crops were infected with an epidemic of mold, Vitis infectious. The potatoes were the farmers' main source of food, and they couldn't eat the rotten disease tubers. 1 million people starved to death during the potato epidemic. Millions more boarded ships and came to North America to start new lives. In New York, landlords rented cheap apartments with no running water or sanitation to the new arrivals. Disease spread quickly in the crowded buildings. Newspaper articles blamed the outbreaks on the new immigrants, and some people said the United States should close its borders. No one pointed their finger at the landlords or the city government, who were responsible for the living conditions in the buildings. When Mary Malone, an Irish immigrant, was identified as the spreader of typhoid, it seemed to confirm the idea that new immigrants were the source of disease. When epidemics strikes, people still look for someone to blame. Immigrants, LGBTQ plus people, Jewish people, Muslim people, people of Chinese heritage, they all become targets. The reality is that the pathogens that cause diseases don't look for people of a particular race, belief, or sexuality. All they need is a human body to infect.